Bem-vindo, telespectador. Meu nome é John Badordi e nós estamos reunidos hoje com Lama Glenn Mullin, o mentor espiritual da Maitreya Sangha Brasil. Renomado Lama da linhagem Gelukpa, tibetólogo, conferencista e autor de mais de 35 livros sobre budismo tibetano, Lama Glenn Mullin foi um dos primeiros ocidentais qualificados a deter o título de Lama. Entre os anos de 1972 e 1984, durante aproximadamente 12 anos, Lama Glenn viveu em Dharamsala, na Índia, onde estudou a língua e a literatura tibetanas, os yogas e as meditações do Buddhismo Vajrayana, sob a orientação de alguns dos maiores mestres do Tibete na época, incluindo o próprio Dalai Lama e seus dois principais gurus, Ling Rinpoche e Trijang Rinpoche. Hoje em dia ensina mundialmente, tendo centros de Dharma como a Maitreya Sangha Brasil na Argentina, na Irlanda e na Coreia, além de conduzir peregrinações pelos locais sagrados da Ásia Central, aproximadamente uma vez por ano. Então, vamos cumprimentar agora Lama Glenn Mullin. Welcome, Lama.
Fabulous, fabulous.
Great. So we would like to make some short interviews to ask you some points about Buddhism in general and specifically about Tibetan Buddhism. The first thing that I would like to ask you is what do you think is the main spiritual goal of Buddhism?
Tibetans use the expression choktung tumung mutra. In other words, we want to do two things. The first is to become better human beings with a more clear mind, a more self-powered mind. For instance, when we're angry, we have no power. Our anger is the power. We lose power. And when we're addicted to something, similarly, we lose our power. We want to go from Shenwang, powered by the klesha, to Rangwang, powered by wisdom and clarity and so forth. So on the conventional level, we want to become a better human being, as Dalai Lama puts it, in terms of clarity, inner joy, and good human qualities, like love, compassion, patience, forgiveness, and so forth. And ultimately, we want to achieve enlightenment, become a Buddha, become a fully enlightened being. And becoming a fully enlightened being really means Sangye in Tibetan, Sang, and the mind purified of dark clouds of not knowing or wrong knowing. and the other host of kleshas that arise from these. And the other hand is expanded, where the mind can, you could say, joyously, radiantly, and unprejudicedly experience each moment, resting in the here and now at all times like a clear pool under a starry sky.
People know that there are that Buddhism has various ways of approaches and various traditions that are called under the umbrella of the term Buddhism. What do you think is the defining characteristic of what we call nowadays Tibetan Buddhism or even Tantric Buddhism?
Well, Buddha himself lived in North India and traveled and taught widely during the 45 years following his enlightenment. But he didn't write teachings himself. He wasn't a philosopher, but rather he taught how to meditate and how to practice for cultivating inner joy, inner clarity, and inner wisdom. So over the early years in India, generations and centuries, Buddhism traveled to many different parts of India, each of which had its own language and its own linguistic structure, its own cultural clothing, if you will. And in each of those areas of India, it developed something of its own character. So if we look at Buddhism in India, we can say, sometimes people use the word early Buddhism, and that's really referring to the kind of Buddhism that was written down in the early conferences. And the main one being during Emperor or King Ashoka's period, 100 years or so after the Buddha had passed away. So quite late. And there they used the language which today we call Pali, a kind of a simplified Sanskrit or something like that. And whoever showed up at that conference and whatever they held of Buddha's teachings, you could say, whatever they remembered, was spoken and transferred from oral to written. So we can call that King Ashoka's brand of Buddhism, or Emperor Ashoka's brand of Buddhism. It was the language he preferred, the written script he preferred, and the approach to enlightenment he preferred. And then a few hundred years later came Nagarjuna, often known as the second Buddha. And he did not accept the conference of Ashoka as final. In those days, of course, there were no internet, telegraphs, telegrams, and so on. Whoever showed up, and that's what they wrote down. And so Nagarjuna gathered many other lineages from the Buddha and many other sutras and tantras and so forth taught by the Buddha that were not recited or represented at that first conference. But he preferred Sanskrit to Pali. So we could say in India, two forms of Buddhism developed. Pali Buddhism under Emperor Ashoka's rule, and then we can say Sanskrit Buddhism. Sometimes these are called Hinayana and Mahayana in Indian literature. In modern day world, they're often called Theravada and Mahayana. And so one is more written in Pali, one is exclusively written in Pali, and the other generally represented in writing in Sanskrit. Often we say Buddha himself taught three levels of teaching: outer, inner, secret, and the secret being Tantra, the other outer, inner being the Hinayana, Mahayana, in the later Indian way of discussing it. So all three of these flourished extensively in India. And the main thing with Tibet is that Tibetan Buddhism is that when these three were at their peak in India, they flowed into Tibet in all three forms. Whereas, say, Sri Lanka mainly received the Pali form, and until today largely preserves the Pali form. And this Pali form from King Ashoka then goes to Thailand and Burma and so forth, became preserved there. From about 1,000 years of the Christian era, the Muslim invasions from Persia, East Persia, started to overthrow the apple cart in India, and the Buddhist world, with its emphasis on sort of large study institutes like Nalanda, Odantapuri, and so forth, came under attack. And so many of the Indian masters were forced to flee into the Himalayas. And at that same time, many Tibetan masters started gathering lineages from India and preserving them, seeing a kind of a end result, negative end coming. Now, China, for instance, mostly has Mahayana translated from Sanskrit, but it also has a translation of the Pali collection. So does Korea, so does Japan. China, Korea, and Japan also have Tantric Buddhism. So they have, often we call these the Trijana, the three vehicles, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. sometimes Shravakayana, Bodhisattvayana, and Vajrayana, Guhya Mantrayana. And the speciality of Tibet is because they were close, very close to the Indian border. And of course, Buddha was from North India. He was born in Nepal, just a few hundred miles from the Tibet border. And Tibet's east-west border with Buddhist India, Buddhist Nepal, is well over 1,000 miles long. So the Buddhism flowing into Tibet flowed continually for a very, very long period of time. Whereas Chinese Buddhism obviously was more far away. They had to travel across the Silk Road and a bit on the boats and trading routes and so forth, but it wasn't such a long, sustained interaction. And of course, Japan and Korea got 90% of their Buddhism from China, so it's a little bit different. And it's unique in that way, I should say.
What exactly is the Tantra? Because nowadays we do not understand properly. I believe that mostly in the West, we do not understand properly what Tantra is, since a lot of misconception came from early waves of his expeditions in India and in the East in general. So how would you define Tantra in the Buddhist tradition, especially?
Well, the word Tantra is sometimes said to mean stream or thread. There's a stream or thread of natural enlightenment in every phenomena and in every moment of our experience. So Tantra tends to look for that stream or thread of natural perfection in each moment. So in that way, it's closer to, say, the Taoism of China and the Sufism of old Persia than it is to many other world traditions. But as often said, Buddha teaching the first level of the Shravakayana or Hinayana, the emphasis is on the three higher trainings: discipline, samadhi or meditative concentration, and wisdom, higher wisdom, meaning examination of the nature of self or non-self, anatma. And Bodhisattvayana, on that basis, Bodhisattvayana sort of expands a little bit to make the emphasis on achieving enlightenment quickly as the best means of benefiting all living beings. So a criticism of the Hinayana by Mahayana masters in India is that the first level of practice taken alone can be a form of spiritual escapism. And we see that criticism in quite a few writings of early Indian masters, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Asanga, Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, and so forth, Shantideva. And it is quite easy, I think, for someone involved in a spiritual path to fall into spiritual escapism. So often in the Buddhist world, the Mahayana Buddhist world, they use the word Uma Madhya, meaning the middle or the center. The example given is we escape the ordinary suffering of the ordinary world by means of developing wisdom, which understands the nature of self, of oneself, and of phenomena. And thus, whatever arises without the sensation of suffering. On the other hand, we escape nihilism, or the escapism as an end to itself, by means of great compassion, love for all living beings, and the intent to achieve enlightenment to benefit all living beings. So after we achieve, you could say, deeper wisdom, our wisdom will naturally turn into a non-escapist mode. That kind of statement is made in a lot of Indian literature, especially from the first century until the end of Buddhism in India with the Muslim invasions. Now, both of these in Tibetan are called Gyugi Lam, the path of causes, because in both of those we see ourselves unenlightened, cultivating the causes of enlightenment, transcending suffering by uprooting the causes of suffering, like escaping confusion and klesha, craziness of the mind or mental darkness, by uprooting those causes. The main difference with Tantrayana or Vajrayana is we no longer practice the path of causes, but rather the path of the result. Result here meaning we link to this Tantra the idea of a thread of natural perfection that's in every moment, every phenomena, and beyond time, place, and so forth. Now, sometimes Hinayana is called the path of restraint because one avoids klesha or negative mind states by being careful about the conditions into which one allows oneself to venture. So one vows. Monks, for instance, can take 250 vows or more, monks and nuns, of restraint, not to do something, but to not do particular things that will have great ability to get them tied up in knots, so to speak. So Tantra, none of those kind of vows are taken, but rather vows of practice, proactive vows are taken. And therefore, it's often said Tantra is for Wangpa Rab, those who are quite mature in the practice and are able to enter into many different sort of environments without the danger of being overwhelmed and corrupted by those, you could say. Now, in the West, when Buddhism came over here, Tantra was really known through the Hindu tantras more than the Buddhist tantras. And in India, Tantra, in the India that was occupied by the British and the Muslims, I should say, Tantra became quite well known for its sexual practices. So generally in Hinayana, Mahayana, there's not really any direction on how to make love in an enlightened way, but rather there's only what not to do, like no underage people and not by force or by trickery and all of this. Whereas how to actually make love creatively is not discussed. And that's the situation with many things, not just sexuality, but especially for the early Victorian Christians, this was very fascinating because Western literature at that time, Western science had almost nothing to say about successful lovemaking. Perhaps something to do with the Garden of Eden, the apple, the snake, the fig leaf, those kind of things. Sex was regarded as something only sacred if it was for childbearing, or only beneficial for childbearing, and otherwise was an indulgence and a vice. Whereas in the Buddhist world and India world, that was never the case. Basically, the positive health effects of lovemaking were always discussed in very ancient texts in Indian Ayurveda, Hindu Ayurveda, Buddhist Ayurveda medicine. Also in China, in the Taoist traditions and the Taoist healing practices, you could say the beneficial aspects of making love properly or in a meditative way or a spiritual way was discussed in great depth. But the Victorians who brought Tantra to the West, and it was the British who conquered India, so therefore the Victorians had the front row seat, you could say, at what was brought West. They sort of hyped up kind of the sexuality of Tantra. But in reality, Tantra just means everything we do should be done with a sense of the natural perfection of what we are doing. And not just in an abstract way, not just in a generic way, but in a very precise way. And for that reason, I think Tantra and sexuality became sort of associated with one another way beyond the context of the actual practice. And one reason for that, of course, is in the West, our most spiritual people in the old days were the Catholic monks and nuns who were celibates. Naturally, there's nothing spiritual about sex if your role model is a celibate. And that gave a kind of a natural predisposition towards sex as just kind of a superficial activity. But Tantra embraces all things of human experience with this same attitude that whatever we do, if it's done on the basis of what's called bodhicitta, the enlightened mind based on the love, compassion for all living beings, and you could say a kind of relaxed sense of the self-centered view of what's going on. Every situation can be beneficial and enlightening. Whether we're eating or we're going to the bathroom, or working in the garden, or whatever we're doing, if we do it with the right motivation and the right mental presence, it becomes a spiritual practice. And that's the same with sexuality. So in that way, I think some people become disappointed by Tibetan Buddhism. They sort of engage in it thinking they're going to become the greatest lovers on the planet. And not everyone can. It's like not everyone can be the fastest 100-yard, 100-meter swimmer, or the 400-meter runner, 1 mile runner, or 1 kilometer runner, or a best basketball player, or whatever. Everyone has their own talents. But what we can do is learn more to understand our own sexuality and how to use that sexuality creatively and beneficially for ourselves, for our enlightenment, and for the benefit of all living beings.
Thank you very much, Lama La. This was all very clarifying in all senses. Thank you very much for your time. This was very productive, and I hope we can meet again soon.
La da do da dee da dee da. We'll meet again. Don't know where, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Yeah.
Lama La.